Ab Weldum Fescadus Adawamlak Amin. Besama Ab Weldum Fescadus Adawamlak Amin. Besama Ab Weldum Fescadus Adawamlak Amin. Yes, good morning, and I hope everyone's doing well. Hope this reaches everyone in good spirits and a positive mood. So Friday today, so almost the weekend. So today's reading is Deuteronomy 21. Give thanks. If someone is found slain in the land which Yahweh your God gives you to possess, lying in the field, and isn't known who has struck him, then your elders and your judges shall come out, and they shall measure to the cities which are around him who is slain. It shall be that the elders of the city which is nearest to the slain man shall take a heifer of the herd which hasn't been worked with and is not drawn in the yoke. The elders of that city shall bring the heifer down to a valley with running water, which is neither ploughed nor sown, and shall break the heifer's neck there in the valley. The priests, the sons of Levi, shall come near, for them Yahweh your God has chosen to minister to him, and to bless in Yahweh's name. And according to their word shall every controversy and every assault be decided. All the elders of that city, which is nearest to the slain man, shall wash their hands over the heifer, whose neck was broken in the valley. They shall answer and say, Our hands have not shed this blood, neither have our eyes seen it. Forgive, Yahweh, your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, and don't allow innocent blood among your people Israel. The blood shall be forgiven them, so you shall put away the innocent blood from among you. When you shall do that which is right in Yahweh's eyes. When you go out to battle against your enemies, and Yahweh your God delivers them into your hands, and you carry them away captive, and see among the captives a beautiful woman who you are attracted to her, and desire to take her as your wife, then you shall bring her home to your house. She shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall take off her clothing of her captivity and remain in your house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. After that shall go into her and be her husband, and shall be your wife. It shall be, if you have no delight in her, then you shall let her go where she desires, but you shall not sell her at all for money. You shall not deal with her as a slave, because you have humbled her. If a man has two wives, and one beloved and one hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son is hers, who has hated, then it shall be, in the day that he causes his sons to inherit that which is his, that he may not give the son of the beloved the rights of the firstborn before the son of the hated, who is the firstborn, but it shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the hated, by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of the father or the voice of the mother, and though they chasten him and he will not listen, then his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out of the elders of the city and to the gate of the place. They shall tell the elders of the city, This is our son, is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. All the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall remove the evil from among you. All Israel shall hear and fear. If a man was committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree. You shall surely bury him on that same day. For he who has hanged is accursed of God. Don't defile your land which Yahweh your God gives you for an inheritance. For these 2 words to give thanks, blessings and love. So yeah, a challenging, really challenging chapter there. It starts off in all the right ways, I think. I mean, it's hard not to read this chapter and read it with a modern context, a modern kind of critique. Do you know what I mean? I think that's pretty much impossible to do. As I say, I try not to do that every time because it just sounds like I'm bashing things and do you know what I mean? And we know that life today is very different to life in the times that the Bible was reading. But when you're faced with chapters like this, it's really difficult to not bring a modern context or critique to it. It starts off quite promising in the sense that if a person is found killed in a vicinity and there's no one around, you don't know who did it, then the nearest city, the elders of that city, should wash their hands over a heifer, and basically say, we don't know who did it. This is innocent blood as far as we know. And it does say in the Bible that when blood is shed on a land, it defiles the land. So they're washing the blood. They're washing their hands over the presumed innocence of that dead person. And we've seen this most famously. Pontius Pilate washed his hands over the judgment that Jesus was going to be crucified because he said that he's innocent of this and he wants nothing to do with this. So the washing of Pontius Pilate's hands is exactly the same, ritual, I guess that's the right word, that comes from this chapter here. But then it takes a dark turn. It starts talking about taking women as a prisoner of war. And if you want to marry that woman, then you're allowed to give her a period of mourning for if the woman's lost her father and mother in that war, then she can shave her head and have a period of mourning, and then you can choose to take her as a wife. If you don't want to take her as a wife, then this is where it gets slightly bit more, I guess, positive. Then she can go on her way as a free woman and you're not allowed to sell her as a slave. But essentially it is saying that if you've taken a woman as a prisoner of war and you want her as your wife, then you can take her as your wife. So it is woman as property. And there's no nice way of skirting around that. And then it gets even darker that it talks about if your son is disobedient and is not listening to mother and father and is basically up to badness, then you can take him to the council of elders. And if the council of elders says that, the son is guilty of being a disobedient child, then the elders may stone them to death, or the people of the village may stone that son to death. Which is extremely dark, extremely dark. I have looked into this, and it talks about in the Talmud, it talks about how that the bar for this was extremely high, to the extent that there's no recorded cases of this ever actually being enacted. And from the things that I've read, it does suggest that this law about stoning the son if you have a disobedient child and they're found guilty of that there's no actual recorded cases of that ever happening. And it is written here as more of a warning and a deterrent than it is an actual case of punishment, because the bar was so high for this to have happened. It wasn't ever a reality. It wasn't ever put into practice. But even the fact that it's written down in quite kind of dispassionate way, as if this is a logical punishment for a disobedient son, is still quite shocking to read, I think. And then it goes on about, and I guess this is less shocking, but relatively speaking, but if a person's hung by a tree, so this is execution, then that body should not remain there overnight, and they should be buried that same night or same day. And this is directly related to the crucifixion of Jesus. We have the cross as a symbol for Jesus, but in actual fact, the historical records do show that the role of crucifixion would have been on a tree. And so they do believe Iyesus Kristos was crucified on a tree, and then, as we know, he was taken down off that tree and taken into the tomb. So again, this is directly from this tradition. So it's interesting that this chapter top and tails with the story that we directly see within Iyesus Kristos crucifixion story, with the washing of the hands, Pontius Pilate washing his hands of the verdict that the Jewish people gave on their King of the Jews, and rejected him and threw him in to be crucified. So it starts off with that echo, or pre-echo, and then it ends with the crucifixion story, analogy. And this is happening very early on in the Old Testament. So two very strong, whether you want to call them prophecies or whether you want to call them kind of, dots to be joined of the Iyesus Kristos crucifixion story. But then in the middle, there's these two very disturbing elements of women being treated as property, and having really no say after that they've been taken as a prisoner of war, family massacred, etc. Then they, if the man chooses, can take that woman as a bride if he sees her to be beautiful. And, do I need to say anything more about that? Of course, that's not the behaviour of the church today, or how we would want society to be today. Hopefully it goes without saying that that is not an advocated position by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, in Ephesians 5, it talks about how husbands are to love their wives in the same way that Jesus loved the church and the assembly. And it talks about that very directly in Ephesians 5. I think it's down near the 20s, 25, that area. Husbands are to love their wives in the same way that Jesus loved the church and the assembly, where they were gathered, or where that he gave himself to. It's words to that effect. So this is what we see here in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy. Again, it's one of these chapters that kind of gives the Bible in the Old Testament a kind of a bad name, in terms of critique of religion, critique of the Bible, because as we know, people do critique and they say, oh, the Bible's full of this and full of that, and it's violence, this, that, and the other. And a lot of it you have to read within context of the time, and it sounds like you're kind of explaining it away every time when you say, well, times have changed, etc. But the reality is times have changed. And you can see that directly with this son analogy of the stoning, that there's no evidence in historical records or in the Bible itself of a stoning of a son for that reason. But we do know that women were stoned for adultery, or supposed adultery. But if the witnesses were of the men's line, then of course they're going to say that she's guilty of adultery, even when she was completely innocent. So we know that it was a brutal time. We know that things were very different. But through the grace of God and the intelligence of, the church fathers, the church mothers, and how society has moved on, being a religious person doesn't mean that you are subscribing to every single thing that the Bible tells you, and you are reacting and acting to that as if you're kind of a fundamentalist, non-brained individual. Because we definitely still know right from wrong, and we do know that actually certain things that happened then aren't what's happened now. We could say that from our own childhood. When I grew up, there was no such thing as seatbelts in cars. There were no drink driving laws, all these kind of things. But we know that times have changed now, now than they were in the past. Through our own upbringing, our parents' upbringing, times have changed. And it is important that even with Orthodox, as it has happened, it does move with the times of society. Obviously, it's going to do that very cautiously, but a church that doesn't move forward is a fossilized church. So even within Orthodox, certain behaviors are not going to be sanctioned, and just because it's written in the Old Testament doesn't mean that that's what they subscribe to. So sola scriptura is not the way, is not the Bible is not the only text. There's other texts and authorities that come into play. So I'll end it there. Blessed day. Have a beautiful day. And God willing, more tomorrow. God willing.